So apparently, I got these messages from Benjamin Sandoval, and apparently, the lesson from Friday was not copied over to zero period. Um, so, in addressing that today, or second period. So, in addressing that today, I'm going to keep the lesson from Friday open. It's not letting me copy it. It's really annoying. To be honest, I've been having some problems with Schoology lately. Let's make this do. Wednesday. Well, maybe we'll make it do Friday, so that gives people time. So let's edit this. So because the assignment wasn't copied over to Schoology for period 0, man, I'm really having problems with Schoology. Because the assignment wasn't copied over to 0 or second period, I'm going to give them until Friday to do it. I'm just trying to get it to copy the stuff over right now. It's just not doing it. Try again in a few minutes. Oh, man. Is it there now? Let's see. Courses, period 2. And it looks like it's there now. So, once again, apologies for that. The assignment that was given on Friday to 4th period was not copied over to 0 period and second period. It is now copied over to 0 and second period. Benjamin Sandoval messaged me over the weekend. I tried changing it yesterday. I was having some difficulty doing so. And so I just thought, you know what, I'm just going to do it today, and I'll make the due date later on this week. So for 0 and second period, you have until Friday to do that now. It is still due on Wednesday, I think. Actually, no, I changed it to Friday for everyone. So it'll be due on Friday for everyone. And I'll worry about that then. In the meantime, there will be other stuff that we're going to do as opportunities. Hello. There will be other stuff that we're going to be doing for opportunities for points between now and Friday. So I'll give you a little bit of time to do stuff. Today we're going to be going over Eastern Absolutism. So we talked about Western Absolutism last time, mostly talking about France. But now we're going to move over to the East and talk about Russia, Prussia, and a few other places. Austria, I think. So I'm just getting that ready right now. Christine, I got your thing. I just haven't updated it yet. I know about the issue, though. I just haven't taken care of it yet. But I will take care of it. I'm going to be updating grades today. It's just that I didn't update grades over the weekend because people are still working on this one. So really there's only like two things to update in the grade book from Monday and Wednesday of last week. And I try and wait for things to accumulate so I can get more done at once because it's such a pain to update everything. So that's why when we do stuff in class, all the stuff is collected all at once and it's all put into gradebook at once because then I can get more done with my time. So I'm just waiting for stuff to accumulate a little bit so that I can put it all in at once, if that makes any sense, rather than having to constantly go back and put stuff in intermittently, which takes a long time. I can get more done if I have several assignments to put in at once. Okay. Apologize about the noise outside. As always, the gardeners are hard at work fiercely here on a Monday morning. Not that it ever gets annoying or anything. Okay, so absolutism in Eastern Europe. We're going to go ahead and get started with this. We only have 9 people watching. I think it's the typical folks who have been tuning in to these online review lectures. Today's lesson is going to be on on absolutism in Russia and Eastern Europe. So I'm going to jump over to the desktop view here and take care of that. Let's see here, just in case Benjamin Sandoval comes in. Well, in case Benjamin, okay, he said hello. So, It's just all this distance learning stuff is such a headache. It's hard to stay organized with things, particularly stuff like late work. People have been, I think I told that you guys that earlier, it's just been really difficult to stay organized because it feels like everything is scattered all over the internet. Okay, cool. All right, so let me fill up my cup of coffee here, and then we'll get started talking about Eastern absolutism. This will probably take me about an hour to get through. It's not a particularly long lesson, but like I said, it's just wrapping up the last little bit of Unit 4. So, all right, all this stuff is going to sound really familiar to you guys. It's Peter the Great and things like that. So, I'm going to grab some coffee, and I'll be right back. Dear Lord, I am so over the sound of leaf blowers. It's probably like my biggest pet peeve. Okie dokie. So, I'm on quite a delay here today, folks. I'm probably on about a 45-second delay, so I apologize for that. Let's go ahead and get started with this. I'm going to jump over to my desktop view so you guys can see what's going on here. Let's put that behind, put that ahead. Okay, hop wrap. 3 aging empires: the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Polish Kingdom. Now, all 3 of these empires are declining, and they are giving way to the rising empires of Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Now, Austria has been around. Okay, they've been kind of part of the Holy Roman Empire, to be honest with you. So it's maybe a little bit of a misnomer, but Austria and Prussia emerge as states from within the Holy Roman Empire that are particularly absolutist states in Eastern Europe. So the Polish kingdom, as you guys know, the story of Poland is that the nobles in Poland had a significant amount of authority, and the only way that things could get done is if there was unanimous agreement between the nobles in Poland, which meant that regionally nobles were able to very much undermine the power of the Polish king, but it also left Poland unable to cope with changing conditions in Europe in a way that would allow them to make change and progress with the times. So in an age of absolutism, Poland finds itself continuing to practice a very feudal style of government, where you had a lot of regional authority delegated out to distant nobles from the king, and this leaves them weak because when they can't get decisions made pertaining to invasions and other stuff, due to the problems that they have with the kind of structure of their governmental system, it ends up resulting in Poland being partitioned away by these 3 new empires. So we all know about the partitions of Poland. So by 1772, there have been 3 separate occasions where Poland's lands have been partitioned away, taken away. and absorbed into these other three empires of Russia, Austria, and Prussia. So, Holy Roman Empire, the last time we talked about the Holy Roman Empire was probably with the 30 Years' War. There were several religious differences in the Holy Roman Empire due to the split in the Catholic Church. So you have Lutherans now, you have Calvinists now, and basically the end of the 30 Years' War ends religious war in Europe, but these religious divisions kept the Holy Roman Empire very divided. So you can see here just how complex the map looks when you try and divide it into the multiple different principalities of the Holy Roman Empire. The Ottoman Empire could not maintain its possessions in Eastern Europe and the Balkans in the face of Austrian and Russian expansion. So when we move further to the south, here's Venice, okay, and then if you move further south over here to the to the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire finds itself in the position of having a weaker and weaker and weaker hold over the Balkan region, which we learned about leading up to the start of World War I, how the Ottoman Empire starts to be referred to by other European places as the sick man of Europe. The Sultan had absolute power in the Ottoman Empire, and after 1560, the decline in Western expansion resulted in the gradual disintegration of the empire. Suleiman the Magnificent, I don't know what. Hi, Dimple. Good morning. This covers up other text here. I don't know why that is so prominently displayed. I am unable to edit this, though. I don't think I can edit it because this is just like in preview mode. But he was probably the most influential leader, Suleiman the Magnificent, of the Ottoman Empire. Let's see here. Ottoman Empire was fairly tolerant regarding religion in the conquered provinces. It was an empire built on expansion, so the Ottoman Empire was all about trying to expand and take over these other territories. But of course, what that results in is taking over lands where people are ethnically different than the Ottoman Turks are. And so, although the Ottoman Turks have a proud history of conquering a bunch of places, a lot of those places similar to Austria, end up breaking away from the Ottoman Empire because it's a multi-ethnic state. And while many of the people who they conquered ended up converting to Islam, they did not, on a national level, identify with Turkish culture. So they would break away and create places like, for example, Syria or Iraq or Iran or Saudi Arabia or what have you. The Janissary Corps. The Janissary Corps, it says, those Christian slaves who were not selected for Ottoman bureaucracy served loyally in the Turkish armed forces. And the Janissary Corps were basically like riflemen. You can see here they've got guns. So the Janissaries were elite groups. If you ever played Age of Empires, is the Age of Empires 2 or Age of Empires 3, you used to be able to play as the Turks. I think 2 is the one that you could do this. You could. There used to be an old game called Age of Empires 2, and it's like a real-time strategy game, a building game where you like build a town and stuff. You used to be able to play as the Turks in that game, and if you played as the Turks, your elite unit that you could create, your elite little military unit, were the Janissaries. And so anyhow, that's kind of a cool little side fact, but. Highly talented children from conquered provinces were incorporated into the Ottoman Empire's bureaucracy or as professionals. And then Poland, Liberum veto. Voting in Polish parliament had to be unanimous for change to be made. This is what I was talking about earlier. So very little could be done systematically to strengthen the kingdom. Prussia and Russia both encouraged certain members to invoke the Liberum veto in order to weaken Poland. And by 1800, Poland ceased to exist as a sovereign state because it gets carved up by Russia, Austria, and Prussia. So here was the territories of Poland, Lithuania in 1635. And then the partitions of Poland, by the time we get to 1772, there's three different partitions that take place between Russia, Austria, and Prussia. In the blue territory, green is like seafoam territory, and then green territory down here is Austria. So these lands get, chiseled away from the side, Russia taking the lion's share of Poland. And this is, again, a thing that would once again happen. In the years leading up to World War II, Poland gets made into a territory after World War I, but they bisect Germany. They cut some land out of Germany to create something called the Danzig Corridor, which is right up in this region here. And it divided East Prussia from the rest of Prussia over on this side. This is all after World War I that they recreated the state of Poland, kind of similar to how it's drawn here on the map, because you had a whole bunch of Polish nationals that lived in this region here, even though it had been taken over by various other places. So the thing that becomes interesting about it is that the Russians and the Prussians partitioned Poland in the 1700s. It remains partitioned for a century or more, and then they retry to take over those lands in World War II, when Germany, Hitler, invades Poland from the west, and then Stalin invades Poland from the east, and the agreement that they have is to divide up those territories. But anyhow, that's when the other European powers step in and declare war against Germany in order to protect Polish sovereignty. Okay, Eastern European absolutism differs from French absolutism because Eastern absolutism is based on a powerful noble class, a weak middle class, and widespread serfdom, whereas in France, the nobility's power had been limited. The middle class was relatively strong, comparatively at least to Eastern Europe, and peasants were generally free from serfdom. Louis XIV built French absolutism on the foundations of a well-developed medieval monarchy and a strong royal bureaucracy of intendants and other folks like that. The threat of war with European and Asian invaders motivated Eastern European monarchs' drive to consolidate their power. So they do reduce the power of the nobility. However, nobles gain greater power over their serfs. So when we talk about having a stronger, more powerful noble class, it's really in comparison to those below them on the hierarchy, not above them on the hierarchy, the social hierarchy. They have three main methods in Eastern Europe of gaining power. Number one is that kings imposed and collect permanent taxes without the consent of their subjects. Number two is that they had permanent standing armies. And number three is that states conducted relations with other states as they pleased. So absolutism in Eastern Europe reaches its height under the reign of Tsar Peter the Great. But we're going to get back to him a little bit later. All right. Ineffective Habsburg rule in the Holy Roman Empire forced monarchs to consolidate their power within the Austrian Empire. This included the reorganization of Bohemia after the 30 Years' War as a major step towards absolutism, the centralization of old Austrian provinces by Ferdinand III, who also created a standing army in peacetime, and then Hungary, the largest part of the empire. Magyars are going to be the dominant cultural group in Hungary, and that that is going to set up, once again, those cultural differences for an absolutist Austrian state that's going to have to mitigate issues dealing with the cultural minorities in their territory who don't identify as being Austrian German, such as the Magyars. Serfdom is intensified during this age. After 1300, lords in Eastern Europe revived serfdom to combat increasing economic challenges. Areas most affected by serfdom after 1300 included Bohemia, Silesia, Hungary, East Germany, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. There's a drop in the population from the Black Death, which created tremendous labor shortages and very hard times, even for nobles, because there's not enough workers to do the work. Uh, Lords demanded that their kings and princes issue laws restricting or eliminating peasants' rights of moving freely, which basically means that peasants in Eastern Europe increasingly get tied to the land and they are no longer able to freely move about as they please. Lords confiscated peasant lands and imposed heavier labor obligations to the peasants themselves. The legal system was monopolized by the local lord, who had total power over who lived on the lands and the kinds of work that they did and where they could go, and also in juridical type affairs as well. Which, by the way, in Eastern Europe, we see a local justice administered in kind of a rogue manner that isn't necessarily centralized by the state. And justice in Eastern Europe is kind of it's kind of a shady affair, we will say. It's certainly not administered in any sort of centralized, systematic way. There's not equal crimes for equal equal punishments for equal crimes. Depending on who you knew, depending on your social stature, depending on XYZ factors, where you were in Europe, in Eastern Europe at this time, could result in quite different administration of justice based on who you were and where you lived. Even across a particular empire, so even within Russia, if you lived under a local lord who was very permissive, maybe you'd get away with things, but generally it would be more the opposite. There were brutal crimes and even more brutal punishments for those crimes. And, it would seem in modern day times, these kinds of things would probably be looked at as cruel or unusual punishment and would not be constitutionally legal in a place like the United States. Non-serf peasants were also affected because they had to provide labor through something called robot. Robot, if you think about the word robot, what does a robot do but menial work, right? The robot does menial style work, labor that's routinous and monotonous. So where that word robot comes from actually goes all the way back to the word robot, which was an Eastern European phrase that it's similar to, I'll tell you what it's similar to, it's similar to in France, they had the corvée, if you remember that phrase, Corvée. The corvée in France was mandatory labor for peasants who would go and do like road maintenance and things like that for a certain number of days out of the year, up to a month out of the year. They would be forced to work. And rabot is very similar to that. Okay, peasants being required to work 3 to 4 days without pay per week for their local lord. And so rabot is not something that the peasants enjoyed, because it's manual labor that you're forced to do. Serfdom consolidated between 1500 and 1650. Hereditary serfdom gets reestablished in Poland, Russia, and Prussia by the mid-17th century. And this period saw the growth of estate agriculture, especially in Poland and Eastern Germany. Why serfdom in Eastern Europe but not Western Europe? Well, the reasons are not solely economic, as Western Europe also experienced the Black Death, yet they didn't bring back serfdom to that degree. Basically, it has to do with this other fact here, the supremacy of the noble landlords. In Eastern Europe, remember, like I told you, local justice is far stronger because Eastern Europe, you think about a place like Russia, for example, but even Austria to some extent, they control huge territories of land. And in Russia in particular, you can go a long distance before you get to your next town or little hovel in the middle of nowhere. And that means that local lords in those areas are going to be more autonomous from the king, as opposed to the nobles who were forced to live in Versailles under the watchful eye of, say, Louis XIV in France. So the supremacy of these noble landlords, okay, kings in Eastern Europe are much more likely to be considered first among equals in the noble class and directly benefited from serfdom. Eastern lords had more political power than in the West. Monarchs needed those nobles to be able to administer the justice, distantly. And constant warfare in Eastern Europe and political chaos resulted in noble landlord class increasing their political power at the expense of the monarchs. I'm just going to take about a 2-minute break here. If you need to get up and grab a glass of water or go to the restroom, please feel free to, but I got to handle something really quickly here. So we'll come back to this in just a few minutes. Okay, so here we are. Sorry about that. Get resituated here. Okay, so hopefully you're all back now. Apologize about that short break. Weak Eastern kings had very little power to control landlord policies aimed at peasants. Peasants were weaker politically in the East than they were in the West. Remember, in the West, the peasants are less vulnerable in France in some ways because the government needs the peasants really bad to pay their taxes. So increasingly in the West, for better or for worse, the peasants find their position in society to be a little bit more secure in the West because of the necessity of the tax system. The position of the peasants within the tax system made their position a little bit more secure in society in some sense. Landlords undermined medieval privileges of towns and power of urban classes as well. In the Austrian Empire, you see the rise of Austria. Ruler was traditionally selected as Holy Roman Emperor. Habsburgs no longer ruled by Spain after 1713. They no longer ruled Spain after 1713 because remember the War of Spanish Succession sees the Habsburg power in Spain end after Carlos II, who it ends up being the Duke of Anjou, who takes over as King of Spain after the War of Spanish Succession comes to an end. Habsburg Empire included Sardinia, Milan, Naples, Austrian, Netherlands, and Hungary and Transylvania. So if you look at these territories, they're kind of all over the place in Europe. All right. You can see here kind of some of the lands that they have. All right, Habsburg domains in 1700. Growth of the Habsburg Empire here. You can see it's a pretty extensive amount of land in Europe controlled by the Austrians. So the government organization of the Austrian Empire, because they are not a national state, they're a multinational empire. We're going to see that Austria is kind of unique in the whole of Europe. So Austria proper had Germans and Italians. Bohemia has mostly Czechs and Germans. Austria has Hungarians, Serbs, Croats, and Romanians. And there's really no single constitutional system within the Austrian Empire. Important Habsburg rulers at this time would be Ferdinand II. He was the one who essentially started the 30 Years' War. He dies, and then Ferdinand III takes over. Ferdinand the Thirdinand. And centralized the government in the old hereditary provinces of Austria. Then you have Leopold I. Leopold I severely restricts Protestantism in the lands of the Habsburgs. There's the siege of Vienna, which successfully repelled the Turks from the gates of Vienna in 1683, and that was the last attempt by the Turks to take Europe over, to take over Austria. And remember, that's going to be something that Austria has been dealing with going back hundreds of years, is the threat of the Ottoman Empire in the east. And so the Austrians had to several times throughout their existence defend themselves against Austrian attacks. Then you have Emperor Charles VI. Charles VI rules from 1711 all the way up to 1714. He's the one who passes this pragmatic sanction law. Okay, so the law of pragmatic sanction said that because Charles VI only had a daughter and no sons, okay, Charles VI wanted his daughter to continue on as emperor of the Habsburg lands, and that was Maria Theresa. Now, it says Austria was saved from Louis XIV during the War of Spanish Succession with its alliance with Britain and military leadership of Prince Eugene. So Austria does not, end up getting taken over due to their alliance with Britain during the War of Spanish Succession against Louis XIV and the French. Maria Theresa ended up inheriting Charles's empire in 1740 and ruled it for 40 years. But remember, when she takes over in 1740, Prussia is going to be the one who challenges this law of pragmatic sanction. So Prussia, the Hohenzollern dynasty of Prussia is the name of the dynasty that runs Prussia and Brandenburg. How does this work in Prussia? Well, the ruler of Brandenburg became one of 7 electors in the Holy Roman Empire in 1417. But basically, by the 17th century, Brandenburg was not really significantly involved in Holy Roman Empire affairs, increasingly marriages gave Hohenzollerns control of German principalities in central and western Germany. So, back in the olden days, you could get married, and marriages, if you were really smart, marriages, let me explain this to you guys. Marriages in this time in Europe are kind of like, if you know anything about sports, they're kind of like predicting who the best prospects for whoever, the Lakers, the Ducks, the Kings, doesn't matter what team that you're talking about, doesn't even matter what sport you're talking about, but it's about trying to predict the future a little bit. You're trying to set yourself up in a situation with a family who's kind of like potentially going to bring you success. The same way that you're trying to pick players from the prospects of ones that are going to, bring your team the most goals or, success down the line. So Prussia, if we were to compare them, it would be kind of like how, let's say I only know hockey, so I'm just going to use the Pittsburgh Penguins as an example. The Pittsburgh Penguins built like a really super successful team over time. And it's because they picked really good players in drafts and stuff, and that some of that was a little bit of luck, but they became a really, really solid hockey organization for a long time because of the fact that they picked good players and they positioned themselves managerially to be able to find some success. Well, Prussia Brandenburg does very much the same thing with these marriages. They find themselves in the position where they gain control over more principalities and their territories grow. There were advantageous things that happen, kind of the same way that advantageous things happen when people get draft picks that are really high up in the lottery or something like that. Oh, we got the first pick, even though maybe we weren't even supposed to get the first pick. That's a little bit of luck. Well, the luck in the marriage side of things is when you have a kid, especially if you have sons, that gives you a lot of leverage. And so, they ended up marrying off members of their family and acquiring territories over time. So this is one of the ways in which Prussia grows into the state that it does at the time that it does. So Frederick William the Great, here, let me pop it back over to desktop view. Frederick William, the Great Elector of Brandenburg, reigned from 1640 to 1688. This is a century before the breaking out of the War of Austrian Succession. So 1 century before that. So I was just talking about 1740 a minute ago, just to let you know this is a century earlier than that. We're now going back to the mid-1600s, right at the tail end of the 30 Years' War. Now, Frederick William, the Great Elector, was a strict Calvinist, but did grant toleration to Catholics and Jews. He admired the Swedish system of government under former Swedish King Gustavus Adolphus, and he admired Dutch economic power, but he ends up actually being threatened by a Swedish-Polish invasion. Let's see here. I wish that I could adjust this, but I can't adjust it, so you'll have to see what this says here. But anyhow, there's basically because of their position in Europe, Prussia is vulnerable to being attacked on all sides, and this is going to be something that, again, is kind of the bane of Germany's existence, is having to fight two front wars on either side, against the French on one side, and then against depending on what time we're talking about, the Poles or the Swedes or the Danes or the Russians or whoever that you're talking about on other sides of their state. So they're kind of in a state of permanent crisis, and this is what allows Prussia to say, look, we need to, if we're going to stick it out in European affairs, we need to have a powerful military force. So early on, Prussia devotes themselves to creating a very disciplined and organized military. So we often credit Frederick William, the Great Elector, with establishing Prussia as a great power and also laying the foundations for the future unification of Germany. Most significantly, he oversaw the Prussian militarism and created the most efficient army in Europe during this time because of the perpetual threats that existed surrounding Prussia at any given time. Prussia Brandenburg was a hyphenated state in the early days. So he unified his Rhine River holdings and Prussia and Brandenburg into a strong state, and heavy taxation for military spending, which was a necessity for fighting against Louis XIV, but also a page out of Louis XIV's playbook. Okay, so here you can see Brandenburg and the territories of Prussia. Here's the Duchy of Prussia over here. But when we think about Prussia, really we pretty much lump all of these regions together. And then the Junkers form the backbone of the Prussia military officer corps. Remember that the Junkers are the officer noble class of Prussia. These nobles and landowners dominated the estates of Brandenburg and Prussia in 1653. Hereditary subjugation of serfs was established as a way of compensating the nobles for their support of the crown. Junkers are young land-owning lords. Their influence over the land and Prussian army gave them power. Okay. Really, Mochi? Are you really? This is what you're doing today? You're just going to jump all over things and wreck my entire... Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. Boy, I'll tell you what. I've had it with these cats. I'm going to be excited to get back to school because they just wreak havoc. All right. Get going, you troublemaker. Get out of here. Jeez. Louise. All right. New industries emerged: woolens, cotton, linen, velvet, lace, silk, soap, paper, and iron products, and efforts at overseas trade largely failed due to Prussia's lack of ports and naval experience, but they are very skilled at creating a disciplined land army. You have Frederick I. Frederick I was sometimes nicknamed the ostentatious king. He's the first king of Prussia. We don't think of Frederick I as being necessarily like this is not Frederick the Great. Okay, Frederick the Great is Frederick II. He's the enlightened ruler of Russia, but this is like the first king of Prussia. He's a very popular Hohenzollern ruler. He sought to imitate the court of Louis XIV, and that's another example in which Western absolutism influences Eastern absolutism, is through the rule of Frederick I. I don't know what encouraged hire means, but it's probably something else cut off again behind this picture. Fought 2 wars against Louis XIV to maintain the balance of power in Europe. The War of the League of Augsburg and the War of Spanish Succession both saw France and Prussia on opposite sides of one another, trying to maintain that balance of power because France was getting a little bit too feisty. He allied with the Habsburgs, and after the Treaty of Utrecht, which we talked about last time, closing out this War of Spanish Succession, the Elector of Brandenburg, Prussia, was now recognized internationally as the King of Prussia in return for aid to the Habsburgs that they provided. Frederick William I is a better-known king of Prussia. Frederick William I was known as the Soldatenkönig. So don't get Frederick I, who was kind of known as the ostentatious king, confused with Frederick William I, who's known as the Soldatenkönig, the soldier's king, or the soldier king. He established Prussian absolutism, infused militarism into society. Sometimes they nickname Prussia the Sparta of the North because they nearly doubled the army's size under Frederick William I, and that makes basically they have the best army in Europe, even though it's the fourth largest. So France, Russia, and Austria all have larger armies, but the Prussians are known for having the best and most disciplined army. 80% of royal revenues are spent on the military. And basically, like I was saying before, because of their vulnerable position being surrounded on all sides by all sorts of threats in Europe, their army was designed to make them so ferocious that no one wanted to mess with Prussia. Most efficient bureaucracy in Europe, the Junkers remained in the officer's castle in the army in return for, I'm sorry, it should say not castle, it should say caste, not castle. They remained the officer's caste in the army in return, like the caste system, meaning like they basically the military. Here's what you have to talk about. The military in Prussia is kind of an asset to Prussia, but also a threat to Prussia. And the reason is because if your military gets too strong, they could overthrow the whole state, like they did with Napoleon. So the Junkers remain the officer's caste in the army in return for support of the king's absolutism. So one of the ways in which the Junkers are subdued to the power of the king at this time is that the king, particularly the Soldatenkönig, commands respect from the Junker class, who could potentially serve as a threat to the king if he was to allow them to do whatever they like. But Junkers are only in their position as officers within the army in return for their support of the king in the first place. So the minute that a Junker was to challenge the king's power, the king could have responded by perhaps restructuring the military to subdue the Junkers within the military to, say, a different group of people. So this is the power exchange that is brokered between the nobles of Prussia and the king of Prussia at this time. They also established a compulsory education system in 1717, where there were about 1,000 schools for peasant children. This gets known later on down the line as kindergarten for kids. Okay, kindergarten. Kinder, I think, just means children in German. Frederick II is the best known of the Prussian kings. I don't know what this guy is. This is such a weird PowerPoint. I don't really use this PowerPoint very often, so I'm not really sure what to tell you about that. But Frederick II we talk about a little bit later when we get into enlightened despotism, so we're not going to talk about him right now. We'll see him later. Okay. Russia's historical background. You got the Greek Orthodox Church. Basically, the Russians pride themselves in being... They're established after the Byzantine Empire. Okay, the Russian Empire is really an extension going all the way back, lineage-wise, even to the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, at least. Sorry, I'm just having a sip of coffee there. So the Russians were Eastern Orthodox. They don't practice Catholicism in Russia. And they were assimilated with the descendants of both the Vikings and the Slavs. And in the 13th century, the Mongols invaded Russia and actually ruled Russia for about 2 centuries. But eventually, princes of Moscow who served the Khan began to consolidate their own rule and replaced Mongol power. And so Ivan the First and the Third were most important with that. You might have heard of Ivan the Terrible. The thing that's really interesting about Russia is that they do have this kind of almost oriental influence in their clothing and so on, having been ruled by the Mongols for some time. What do we have here? Any, okay, cool. All right, so, oh boy, now this is all going to be covered up. All right, so what this essentially says in the background is that you see the establishment of a new dynasty in Russia, okay, after the local Muscovy rulers take away power for themselves. Now, the Russians, like I said, high nobles are going to have these beards, okay, big bushy beards. And you can remember that Russian nobles are known as boyars. So, because Russia's size is, Russia, you have to remember, is a slow start in Europe at this time. Russia gets a slow start to things. They really, they struggle in the early days. Russia's size is very much an obstacle to central rule. And so the Russian princes, the Muscovy princes, because remember, Russia starts off as the Kingdom of Muscovy and then eventually turns into Russia down the line under Peter the Great, basically. But these Russian boyars, you know, are kind of an obstacle to centralizing, because the Russian boyars, like other nobles in Eastern Europe, saw themselves as having certain local privileges that they didn't want interfered with. Ivan III, or Ivan the Great, from 1442 to 1505. In 1480, he ended Mongol domination of Muscovy, and he declared himself a hereditary ruler. Now, we do see after these guys, here's a Muscovite boyar, here's Ivan IV. He was known as Ivan the Terrible, okay, but he ends up basically taking the title of Tsar for the first time. He marries a Romanov, and so territorial expansion under Ivan IV, where they start to control the Black Sea region. They won huge eastern territories under Ivan the Terrible and gained territories in the Baltic as well. And here's a map of kind of Muscovy or Russian territory at that time. And if you move further down here in the PowerPoint, you can see St. Basil's Cathedral. Ivan IV ordered the construction of this church to commemorate Muscovy's victory over the Kazan and Astrakhan, and the structure was completed in 1555, 1561, and it's a very prominent feature of Moscow even today. You can see here it lit up at night. Now, this began a process of westernization in Russia, but it's going to be a slow process. Remember that we don't see Peter the Great come around for another full century after this, and even then, it's not super westernized. We don't really see Russia undergo all of the kind of Frenchification to their culture, or westernization of their culture until the start of the 18th century, the start of the 1700s. But waged costly wars with Poland, Lithuania for 25 years. Cossacks, that's a term you should probably know. Many peasants fled east and formed bands of outlaws that get known as Cossacks. They reduce, Cossacks are also independent and usually they're peasants, but they're like higher up of the peasant class. All right. Reduced the power of the boyars. All nobles had to serve the Tsar in order to keep their lands. And then they enter into this time of troubles after his death. You see these Cossack bands traveling northward, killing nobles, rejecting the rule of Ivan. And so here's the deal. Time of troubles. There's a period of time called the Time of Troubles for Russia from about 1584 to 1613, where times are confusing. And, Sweden and Poland actually end up coming in and conquering Moscow. Nobles end up electing Ivan's grandnephew as a new hereditary Tsar. And this creates a brand new dynasty called the Romanov dynasty under Michael Romanov, who was chosen by the nobles but didn't really want to become Tsar. And he's kind of a distant pick from Ivan the Terrible. But he starts the Romanov dynasty, and the Romanov dynasty, or the Romanov dynasty, lasts all the way for the next 300 years up until the end of World War I, which was only a century ago. So Michael Romanov is the first of a long line of Romanov Tsars of Russia. Now, we do get a few odd ones in there, like Catherine the Great, who technically doesn't even have any Romanov blood in her at all. She is a German princess, but nonetheless takes the title of Tsarina of Russia in the 1700s. So, changes in Russian society at this time. Nobles gained military exemptions. The rights of peasants declined during this time. We also see serfs at this time. Old believers resisted new religious sects from the West, like Lutheranism and Calvinism, and they were severely persecuted by the government. They do continue the process of westernization during this time, and by 1689, Russia is the world's largest country. It's actually 3 times the size of Europe alone. And that's when we start to see now Peter the Great. And so we're making our way up to Peter the Great's reign, which is really the first significant thing that we need to talk about pertaining to Russian Eastern absolutism of this time period of the 1600s, because Russia isn't truly absolutist until Peter the Great. It is absolutist in the sense that you have a Tsar, and we've seen a process of Russia moving towards absolutism, but it's really Peter the Great that kind of codifies the law system and centralizes the Russian military and does some other things. Background, his sister Sophia ruled as his regent early on. She had plotted to kill him. I don't know if you remember the video that we watched, and there was that Russian uprising where they tried to overthrow Peter the Great, and he had his sister Sophia, she was forced into a nun, forced to live in this, like, top of this castle in, like, basically a prison cell where he strung up the co-conspirators and outside her windows, so that she would be forced to look at them as she spent the rest of her days in solitude as a nun. And so it's pretty gruesome. Peter was nearly 7 feet tall. I don't know if you remember that. He's a huge, and that was the Streltsy Revolt that we're talking about. The Streltsy Revolt. You guys, they get defeated in 1698. The Streltsy, and there's that painting that I sent out to you guys. I made a joke out of it where it was like me looking at the AP Euro kids after the Age of Absolutism test, which, if you guys recall, you did not do very well on. And it was the painting of Peter the Great looking at the Streltsy in the picture, who are being shamed after their attempted uprising, and the guy's candle is about to be put out or whatever. So anyhow, but that was in that documentary that we watched, which was Empire of the Sans, narrated by that one British chick who has the funny accent, right? Look at him, he looks absolutely implacable in this image here, right? I don't know if you guys remember that whole documentary, but that's where we learned about Peter the Great and his emphasis in modernizing Russia. The security of Peter's reign is now intact after the Streltsy Revolt is subdued. Peter was so strong he could actually bend horseshoes with his bare hands. He was just a massive individual. And Peter's major concern was military power. So each Russian village at this time is required to send recruits for the army, and it's like 25-year enlistments. I don't know if you guys know this, but that's like a super long time. That's basically a guarantee that you're not leaving the military. 25-year enlistment may as well be a life sentence, because you're probably not going to last 25 years in the Russian military. If they went to war, you're going to die. And so 25-year enlistments may as well be lifelong enlistments. We have 4-year enlistments here by comparison. If you enlist in the U.S. military, it's a 4-year commitment. And then you have the opportunity to either leave or re-up after that. 75% of the national budget is spent on the military. As you can see, huge. One of the hallmarks of absolutism, and Eastern absolutism in particular, is that huge budget spent on the military, creating a standing army. There's a royal army of over 200,000 men at that time, which was large, but not insanely large comparative to later, which Russia gets huge. There is an additional 100,000 special forces of Cossacks and foreigners. It's large, but comparative to its size, that would be expected. So, and remember that Russia's at this time, it hasn't undergone the population growth of the agricultural revolution yet. So Russia's population, albeit large, is very spread out and not very large comparative to, say, France. Okay. Established royal military and artillery academies at that time under Peter the Great. All young male nobles were required to leave home and serve 5 years of compulsory education. He builds a large navy on the Baltic, but that navy does decline in power. After Peter's death, you might remember his ship called the Standart, and non-nobles had the opportunity to rise up in the ranks. One of the most notable conflicts that happens under Peter the Great is going to be that Great Northern War. The Great Northern War between Russia and Sweden. Russia, Denmark, and Poland and Saxony as its allies versus Sweden under Charles XII. And this, the notable battle, the most decisive battle where Russia defeats Sweden was the Battle of Poltava of 1709. And that basically ends the Great Northern, well, it doesn't end the Great Northern War, but that's the most decisive battle of it. The Treaty of Nystad doesn't get negotiated until about a decade later, where Russia gained Latvia and Estonia and gained its window to the west in the Baltic Sea. So these are the Russian gains you can see in green lines here over these yellow territories. And this gives Russia the window to the west in order to be able to trade on warm water ports in at least part of the year on the Baltic Sea. Okay, modernization and westernization were Peter's major focuses. He is kind of like the he's the Louis XIV of the East, to the extent that he is able to force nobles in Russia to comply with new practices. So he traveled to Western Europe as a young man to study in the Netherlands, in the Dutch Republic. He travels to England, he travels to France, and he learns about Western European culture and practices and absolutism, and learns about ships and other things like that. So when he gets back to Russia, he imports many Western technicians and craftsmen to aid in building, for example, factories. Now, when I say factories, I'm not talking about like textile factories in the sense that we see in the Industrial Revolution, but we're talking about, factories that would allow them to start building things like boats and other things like that. So we do see factories of an earlier pre-industrial generation, but I'm not talking about the kinds of like machine factories that we're talking about. We're talking about factories where people build stuff, but it's usually by hand. By 1725, Russia outproduced England in iron, but not Sweden and Germany. Industrial serfdom exists in factories where workers could be bought and sold. After he returned from Western Europe, remember that Peter decreed that the boyars cease to wear their big bushy beards, long traditional robes, and other Eastern fashions cease to exist after Peter the Great, who starts forcing people to do things like, eat with silverware and other stuff like that, because he was dealing with a bunch of kind of barbarian type noble old school Russian guys, and he's trying to kind of get people on board to modernize and become more, if you will, quote unquote, civilized, at least according to the French definition of that word. Government became more efficient. Tsar ruled by decree. He created the table of ranks. I don't know if you remember that, which set an educational standard for civil servants, most of whom were nobles. And Peter the Great is really trying to replace those old Russian boyar nobles, the kind of nobles of the sword, nobles with new service-based nobles. So he's kind of trying again to pull that sort of Louis XIV, where he's trying to subdue old nobles and kind of rise new rogue nobles up, if you will, that will be loyal to the Tsar and undermine the old families. Russian secret police ruthlessly and efficiently crushed opponents of the state. Taxation, heavy on trade sales and rent head tax on every male. And then state control of the Russian Orthodox Church starts to occur at this time as well. St. Petersburg is the city established by Peter the Great. It's probably his most crowning achievement, in addition to building the navy and the port there. He sought to create a city similar to Amsterdam, and his palace, the Peterhof Palace, is sometimes called the Versailles of the East because it's so beautiful. By his death, the city was the largest in Northern Europe with 75,000 inhabitants. So he pretty much single-handedly establishes St. Petersburg, and of course, at that time, it became the capital of Russia. It's cosmopolitan in character, and it's seemingly kind of the future of Russia. Construction had begun in 1703. They had forced people to build it. Merchants and artisans also were ordered to live in the city and help build it. But he's doing this in a very absolutist way, right? This is ordering people to do it. They didn't have a choice. It's not like establishing something freely and then having people freely make the decision to come and settle there. He forced people to live there. He forced people to participate in making it work. And so Peter the Great, really, when we give him credit for establishing St. Petersburg, it's because he forced it to be established. He willed it to be established by making people live there and forcing people to contribute to it. Peasants were conscripted heavily into labor in the city's construction, and there was a heavy death toll. There may have been even 100,000 peasants who were killed in the establishment of St. Petersburg as a city. So this is a brutal kind of establishment of a city, which is kind of how the Russians have a track record of doing things. So you can see how similar in some regards Peterhof Palace is to Versailles. I would say it has perhaps a little bit lighter feel to it because of the use of lighter colors inside, but you still do have heavy Baroque gold, ornate, designs here. And the statues out front as well are all gilded, very similar to the statues out front in Versailles. Now, they do use some lighter colors like white and yellow and pastel type colors, which is, I would say, probably signaling the upcoming art movement of the Rococo style, which remains highly decorative, but is maybe a little bit lighter and less heavy in its feels. Moving forward here, these are all just pictures of the Winter Palace. All right, Peter's reforms modernized Russia and brought it closer to, mainstream Europe. It becomes a more modern military and state bureaucracy modeled after the French kind of way of doing things. Culture also changes. The behaviors and attitudes of people, the nobles in Russia, change a bit under Peter the Great. The state becomes more centralized, but still remember that Russia is large and populated very disparately, meaning that people don't live close together. They live far apart from one another. And so distant nobles may have retained more autonomy in a place like Russia than, say, a place like France. Tsar began issuing explanations to his decrees in order to gain popular support. So instead of just decreeing things, he would start explaining his reasoning behind why he was decreeing things. And this felt like it gave people that simple explanation, in some sense, allows the Tsar to have a higher support from the population. All right. So that brings us to the end of reviewing Eastern absolutism. Took us a little over an hour here to get through, minus the first 10 minutes or so of getting things set up here. So that kind of is what you need to know about Eastern absolutism. We broke down today Russia, Austria, and Prussia. And I can pop this back over to me now. So we basically covered Russia, Prussia, Austria. We also talked about a little bit about the falling empires of the Holy Roman Empire, the Polish Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. So hopefully, that works. I will be updating grades today. I'm going to be uploading your assignment onto the folder on Schoology. I'll be making a new folder. This time I'm going to double check and make sure it actually copies over so that we're not stuck with the same dumb situation. Christine Caneda, I will figure out your thing. The reason that happened, Christine, is because I put the scores in last week on Sunday night. And because I put the scores in on Sunday night, that meant that a couple of people handed it in technically before it was due, but I did not see it because I had already entered it. And so that's why that happened. But I will fix that today for you and for any others. I'm going to be updating grades across the board today. So, hey, get out of here. Get, you little varmint. All right. So, if there is something small, Mochi will find it to play with it. And most likely it's going to get lost. So, you got to keep an eye on that little rascal. But, I'm going to leave it off there. As you can see, it is 9:47, so I have to get things... situated here for my next class, which is my regular world history class, and we're going to be starting up a new unit. You're obviously welcome to tune into that as well. You just have to go to my YouTube channel and click the new live video. Last Friday's wasn't that long because we just finished a unit, but we're going to be getting started on a new unit here today talking about World War II. So if you have any interest in learning something new, you're obviously welcome to join in on that, but it's not pertinent to what we're doing in our class because you're not going to be asked anything on the AP exam passed about the year 1910. So we already covered all the way up to 1910, so all I've been doing is reviewing with you guys because I feel like that's the most important for those of you who are still planning on taking the AP exam. It's kind of a weird year, guys. I don't know what to tell you about it. I mean, I'm making as much sense out of it as I can. I feel sad in a way, to be honest with you, because I really enjoyed you guys. I really enjoyed my classes this year, and I feel like I got a little bit shrifted on a really good year of instruction with you guys, and it's a bummer because I miss seeing you guys, and I miss the routine of going to work in the morning and being able to talk with you guys and interact with you. So anyhow, I appreciate that you tune into these, and feel free to join in on the regular World History lecture if you want to learn a little bit about the start of World War II. We're going to be looking at that today, and I'm going to be updating grades for them as well. So if you don't have any questions on Eastern Absolutism, I also want to recommend to you guys to go back and look at your reading guides, because the reading guides, if you spent some time looking over those reading guides, boy, could that really be helpful for you in looking over this stuff. I'm going to be doing just a little short, for today's assignment, it's just because I already have that other huge one, that today's one is just going to be a short Quizlet, or quizzes, or whatever it's called, on Eastern Absolutism. So I will post that in a little bit, and you'll have until Wednesday to get that done. Okay, and then it'll be the same thing. You just upload the screenshot of your final score when you complete it. You just upload the screenshot and put it on there, and then I'll give you credit for it as we go down. Remember that the point values may change. I may make it worth more points because but I want to make sure that for those of you who are choosing to do the distance instruction, that it actually does have a benefit to your grade. So I just haven't had to do anything like this before, so I got to feel it out and see how much over time, let's say 5 points adds over time or 10 points adds over time. I'm trying to figure out the appropriate amount to give you guys to make sure that for those of you who are doing what you need to do, that your grade, that you'll feel it in your grade, that it'll go up over time. So I do want to reward the efforts for those of you who are participating, and it will have a measurable impact on your grade. I just have to figure out what the right numbers are. So, being that there are no questions, if there are no questions, I will leave it here and get things going for my regular world class. Thanks so much for tuning in. Sorry again, we got started late today. Actually, my alarm didn't go off this morning. That's why I started late. So I woke up about 5 minutes to 8 and realized, oh my gosh, it's 5 minutes to 8, and my alarm had not gone off. So my sincerest apologies for that. I think I accidentally set it for PM looking at it this morning. That's what I figured out I did. So I will make sure not to do that anymore. Good thing it wasn't like a regular work day. But yeah, no problem, guys. Happy to do it for you. And you guys take care. Have a great rest of the day. And we'll talk soon.